Welcome to the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. I'm Christian of Standing Stones Healing, founder of the Reiki Business Collective and creator of the Build Your Reiki Business program, sending blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business. Greetings, welcome, and thanks so much for joining me for this week's episode of the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. I'm Christian of Standing Stones Healing, and I am grateful to have you here, so thank you so very much. In this week's episode, we're talking about how to end a Reiki session. How to end a session. Because we previously talked about how to begin a session, how to start a session. Now, interestingly enough, that is not last week's episode because I messed up a little bit with the sequencing. And so the episode prior to this one is about email, but the one before that is about how to start a Reiki session. So you can feel free to tune in on that. But in this episode, we're going to talk about how to end a session. Now, before we jump into that, I want to make sure to mention that the Build Your Reiki Business program is going to be opening for enrollment again soon. And if you're interested in the program, if you're interested in joining us, join the wait list at standingstoneshealing.com/build, because everyone on the wait list will have the opportunity to join before the program officially opens for enrollment. So don't miss out, standingstoneshealing.com/build. Thank you. The way in which I might encourage us to end a session is actually the same way in which I encourage us to start a session, and that's with listening. I think that listening is one of the most important skills. Actually, I think it's the most important skill that we can have as Reiki practitioners. And the more and better that we can listen to our clients, the better that we can serve them. And so I believe that at the end of a session, we should really be putting the focus on listening first and foremost. So what do I mean by that? I mean listening to the client's experiences, if they would like to share any experiences that they had, listening to how the client feels, listening to anything that comes up for the client, and listening for any questions that they might have. I think so often as Reiki practitioners, we are very eager to share with the client things that we might have seen or felt or experienced during the session, any visions or messages that we received. So often we're very eager to share those things. And I know I've been there too in my Reiki sessions where it's been like, wow, what a powerful message. I've got to share this. I can't wait until the session is over to share this powerful message. Yep, I've been there too. But I think that it is really best for us to put the client first and foremost before our desire to share any kind of messages or information, and to hear where the client is, what the client has to say, what the client is feeling. And so rather than at the end of our sessions jumping to share messages, I think that it's really important for us to make sure that we're serving the client's needs by asking them how they're feeling and asking them how they're doing. And so I recommend at the end of the sending of the Reiki, how I end my sessions is that I'll do it in a couple of ways. And so I let the client know this beforehand. If you recall from the How to Start a Session episode, I talk about setting expectations for the client and making sure that they know what to expect and what's going to happen. And so I'll tell them before the session that when I ding a bell or I play my flute, that signals that I have stopped sending Reiki and they are welcome to, come back, quote unquote, come back in whatever way feels appropriate to them. And so they already know at the beginning of the session that there's going to be a signal. So at the end of the session, I ding the bell, play my flute, bang my drum, whatever it might be. Then after that, I will ask them how they're doing. Now, of course, I'll give them a little bit of space and not just be like, ding the bell. Oh, okay. How are you doing? How are you feeling? But give them a little bit of time, a little bit of space. I will often in this time continue to bang my drum or play my flute. To just allow them to lay on the table, sit on the chair, and just sit in that moment for a moment. And when they're ready, I invite them, when they're ready, they can sit up or open their eyes or, whatever feels appropriate to and comfortable for them. And to, when they're ready, ask them how they're doing, ask them how they're feeling. And I think that if we lead with questions, it opens up the opportunities and the possibilities for the client to lead with the answers. Anytime we are asked questions, like in an interview, for instance, when someone is asking us questions, we might feel that they have all of the power because they're the ones asking us the questions. So like in an interview, for instance, we might feel like the interviewer has all of the power because they're the one asking all of the questions. But the truth is that the answerer, the interviewee, has just as much power because they have full power in how they answer the questions. And so when we are asking our clients questions rather than telling them things, we are giving them the power to answer in the way that feels right to them. And so we are giving the client control with our questions. And so I recommend just asking the client how they're doing, how they're feeling. You don't even have to ask them, did anything come up for you? Because then that almost assumes that something should have come up for them. So if we say to a client at the end of a session, whoa, how was that? Did anything come up for you? What did you feel? What did you see? What messages did you get? Then we're really suggesting that they should have felt something. They should have received messages. They should have seen colors or heard harp music and birds singing or whatever. We're actually, with that kind of question, suggesting that they should have had those kinds of experiences. When, of course, we know that in Reiki, we can have a wide variety of experiences, and none of them are better than any other, and none of them are more right than any other. I have a video on my YouTube channel talking about what if a client doesn't feel anything. And indeed, we may have clients that don't feel anything, either during or after a session. But by asking leading questions like that, we almost set up the expectation that they should. And when they feel like they should have felt something, they might feel like something is wrong with them if they didn't feel anything or see anything, or angels didn't visit during the session, or whatever other things might happen during a session. So I encourage us to let's give the client the power and the control, and allow them to tell us their experience without asking leading questions that suggest that they should have had some particular experience. And so if you say to a client, oh, how are you feeling? And they're like, oh, I feel good. I feel a little tired, but I feel good. Well, that's great. You're welcome to ask them to say more about that. You might want to even ask them, oh, you felt tired? Are you okay? Do you want to say any more about that? rather than saying something like, "That's it? You didn't see any colors or feel any sensations? You didn't feel any heat or energy, or what the heck is wrong with you?" So let's just be mindful of the questions that we're asking clients and how that might impact their experience of the session and their feelings about how they should or should not be feeling during or after a session. So I encourage leading with very welcoming and opening kinds of questions. I also encourage us to be mindful of the feedback that we give to clients. Now, again, I mentioned previously, I have done this myself in my own Reiki practice with clients, where I have been eager to share some really profound things that have come through during the session. Of course, always getting permission from the client beforehand. This is very important, particularly even at the start of a session. However, it's also important for us to be mindful that if we say to a client at the beginning of a session, "Is it okay if I share messages with you?" then that suggests that we're going to receive messages. And of course, we might not. And then the client might feel like, "Oh, you didn't get anything from me? Well, what's wrong with me?" So again, I believe it's always very important for us to be mindful of the ways in which we're talking to clients and offering information, and even offering that we might have information to offer. As it pertains to feedback, I really believe that oftentimes less is more. So oftentimes we might get lots of messages, we might have lots of things come through, and we might want to share all of that with the client. But sometimes it can be a little overwhelming for the client. At least I know this in my own experience as the client who received a lot of feedback during a session, or I should say after a session, where the practitioner was like, "Oh, well, this came up in this and this message and this and this and this, and then there's this and this," and I was like, "Wow, that's a lot of stuff. That's really a lot." And so I can speak from my own experience as the recipient that sometimes less is more. And yes, indeed, we can share too much and we can offer too much information. And I think it's important for us to be mindful of that. I think it's also important for us to be mindful of the way in which we are sharing information. I once had a client who, when she had a session with me, it was her second session. She'd had Reiki before from a previous practitioner. And she told me about the experience and said, "I enjoyed the session, but afterward, the practitioner, she told me that my heart chakra was blocked," or something like that. I forget exactly what it was, but definitely there was some chakra that was blocked. And definitely my client did not feel good about that. And so I personally never talk about chakras as blocked. I don't like that term. I don't use that term. And I personally, in my practice, don't quote unquote see chakras as blocked or unblocked. And I honestly don't even believe that that's the case with chakras. I really don't dive into chakras in my own Reiki practice. And that's just my own personal preference. I've never been very invested in the chakra system itself. But I don't talk about them. I certainly don't talk about them as blocked or unblocked. I don't see them in that way. But anyway, when we use a term like blocked, I think that can really have a client feeling like there's something wrong with them. And I don't think anyone likes to be told that their heart chakra is blocked, for instance. And I honestly don't think it's helpful. And so I know from this particular client that I'm thinking of, she really did not appreciate being told that and really left the session with a kind of a bad taste in her mouth feeling about it. And even some questions of like, what does that even mean? And what do I do about that? And almost even kind of like, who are you, lady, to tell me that? And honestly, I agree. Who are you to tell someone that their chakras are blocked? And so I think it's just important for us to be mindful of how we are offering that kind of information. And if we do have information to share with a client that is maybe quote unquote negative, or maybe construed in a negative kind of way, that we really, really are very careful about how we are sharing it. Our words have power. What we say to one another has power, whether we realize that or not. And so let's recognize in our sessions that we do have power in the way in which we present information. And so let's please be careful and mindful about the ways in which we are talking to clients and sharing information. So how we offer feedback is very important at the end of a session, because it can really, like with that client that I mentioned, impact our overall experience of the session itself. And it can actually have an impact on whether or not that client comes back. As far as whether or not a client comes back, at the end of a session is absolutely an appropriate time to inquire about a next session. And so at the end of a session is a great time to see if the client would like to come back and to book another session. You have them there, you have them with you. There's absolutely no harm in asking if they would like to book another session to come back. There's absolutely no harm in asking if they would like to book a package of sessions. And as a matter of fact, it's just good customer service. You know, if you ask the client if they want to come back and they say no, then you know that they don't. Or if they say, I need to check my schedule, then you know they need to check your schedule. But if you don't ask, then you have no idea if the client might like to come back. And maybe the client might prefer, while they're there, to schedule and make it easy on themselves to get on your schedule for their next session. And so I've heard people say that, asking if someone wants to schedule at the end of a session is not an appropriate time to do it. And I disagree. There is nothing wrong with that whatsoever. And I think in many ways, it's simply good customer service. If the client doesn't want to, they'll say no. And if the client is not inclined to outright say no, they'll just say something like, I need to check my schedule. But it's absolutely okay to do that. And I think it's simply good customer service. Let's assume that the client wants to come back. Why not? Let's assume that the client wants to come back unless they tell us that they don't want to come back. It's almost like at the end of a first date. Let's assume that the person we're on a date with, that is provided that we want to have a second date. You might have a first date and decide you don't want to have a second date, right? You might also have a first session with a client and decide you don't want to have a second session with a client. I know I've been in this situation myself. And so it's okay for us to determine that we don't want another session with the client. But at the end of a date, a first date, it's absolutely okay and appropriate if you would like a second date to say at the end of the date, so when can I see you again? That's completely appropriate. And so it's completely appropriate at the end of a Reiki session to also say, so when can I see you again? It's okay to assume that the client would like to come back. There's nothing wrong with that assumption. And if the client doesn't want to come back, they'll let you know. Maybe they're too polite to say it outright that, well, actually, I don't really care for you and I'm not coming back. They'll let you know in another way. And so it's okay. You're not being pushy. You're not being intrusive to simply ask someone if they would like to come back. And so at the end of a session, I recommend saying to a client, when would you like to come back? Or if that sounds a little too pushy, would you be interested in a follow-up session? I have my schedule here. Would you be interested in another session in a couple of weeks? Or, however it feels right to and appropriate to you. But it's absolutely okay to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. And the client might prefer that. And you don't know if that's the client's preference unless or until they tell you otherwise. They might like to come back. So using the end of the session as an opportunity to schedule the client in for the next session is a great thing to do. There's this technique out there that's called book a meeting from a meeting. BAM FAM is the name of it. Book a meeting from a meeting. And this principle is simply that when you are in a meeting with someone and there's going to be a follow-up meeting, schedule that meeting during the meeting. And so don't end the meeting without scheduling another meeting. And you can absolutely use this in your Reiki practice as well. So book a session from a session, and that is absolutely okay. At the end of a session, I believe that it's very important for us to answer any questions that clients might have. And so if they say something to us like, oh, I had this tingling in my foot during the session, what does that mean? To be able to have a dialogue with the client about it and to listen to and answer their questions and to welcome any questions they have in a very open and welcoming kind of way. In a way that says, no question is silly. You are welcome to ask any questions that you have, and I am going to be open and forthcoming in the answering of those questions, including when I don't know the answers. And so if a client says something like, oh, my foot was tingling during the session, what does that mean? Answering it in a way that doesn't sound dismissive. So to say something like, oh, that was just energy leaving the body. Just energy leaving the body. And to feel that we need to provide a definitive answer that is just the way it is, and it's black and white, and this is the answer, and it's, quote, just that. Well, who knows? Maybe it's something else. Maybe their foot was falling asleep during the session. And so bringing a sense of exploration to the questions rather than offering definitive answers, because who knows? Yes, indeed, maybe the tingling of the foot was just simply their foot falling asleep. In this kind of instance, for me personally in my sessions, I will say something like, oh, your foot felt tingly, so I will reflect back to them what they observed. So, oh, your foot felt tingly? That's interesting. Tell me more about that. So acknowledging their feeling, validating their feeling, and just asking for more information and getting more information to help understand where they're coming from, because our answer is going to be different depending upon how the client feels about it. If the client is like, yeah, my foot was tingling and it really freaked me out, then our approach to answering their question is going to be different from if they say, yeah, my foot was tingling and that was freaking awesome. And so knowing how the client feels about something is really helpful for us in our responses. But I really advocate being very open and welcoming of the questions and open in the ways in which we answer them. When it comes to ending our sessions, I believe that the next session begins with the previous session. Now, what I mean by that is that similar to this idea of booking during the session, booking the next session during the session, but not exactly, but it is related, is that when we are having discussions with a client at the end of a session, they are forming opinions. And that discussion is actually going to, in their mind, reflect upon the session itself. So let's say during the session, the client had just a wonderful Reiki session. They felt so relaxed. They felt wonderful. But then at the end of the session, as you were discussing, they felt rushed. They felt unheard. They felt dismissed. That ending of the session is actually going to impact their impression of the whole session. And so they're going to leave the session with you remembering how things ended and not remembering so much how positive they felt during the session itself. Our most recent impressions impact our previous impressions. So that means that the client could have a really great session with you up until the end of the session, and that could have a negative impact on them. And when they reflect upon the session itself, because the end of the session was the most recent experience, the chances are pretty good that that feeling is going to impact their feeling about the rest of the session. And so we always want to leave a client on a positive note. We always want to leave people better than when they came to us in all of our interactions. And so this is important just as a sending love and light into the world kind of thing. But it's also important from a client experience perspective and how they remember their experience with you. We want to leave them on a positive note so that they are leaving the session with a positive impression and positive feelings when they later reflect back on the session. And so in this way, our next session with them has already started before that current session ends, even outside of a scheduling framework. And finally, for ending a session, I encourage following up afterward. With all of my sessions with my booking system, anyone who schedules with me automatically gets a follow-up email the next day saying, "Thank you so much. I appreciated meeting you. It was an honor to serve you. And here's a link if you would like to leave a review." So I have that set up in my system that automatically everyone who schedules gets a thank you email with a link to leave a session if they like. Now, in that thank you email, you could put a link to book another session. And so just the way that I book my sessions at this time, that isn't something that I currently do, but I have done and you can do, and it can be very helpful as well. And so having a link for them to book another session is a great idea, but I definitely recommend encouraging them, inviting them to leave a review. In addition to that, I personally like to follow up with each of my clients afterward. Now, sometimes I have too many clients to where this is a little bit more challenging for me to do and I'm not able to. But I like to send out a message, whether it's a personal email or a DM, whatever it might be. I like to follow up personally with the client and send them a message within a week. I like to do it within a week, asking them how they're doing. Just to say, "Hey, it was great to see you last Friday or whenever, and just wondering how you're doing. Just like to check in and see how you're doing." I like to do that. This is also another opportunity to invite them to schedule another session if they so wish. So these are some ways that I like to end a session. How do you end a session? Please do drop it in the comments for us if you're listening in on YouTube. And of course, please do join us in the Reiki Business Collective at facebook.com/groups/Reiki Biz and tell us how you like to end a Reiki session. Sending so many blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business. Thanks for tuning in to the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, and send to a friend. Learn more about the Build Your Reiki Business program at standingstoneshealing.com/build, sending blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business.